Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a quirky, fascinating little moment in history. Napoleon's haircut before one of his biggest battles. Imagine the scene. It's the eve of a massive confrontation. The weight of an empire on his shoulders. The thundering march of armies just beyond the horizon. And yet, Napoleon, amidst all this chaos, insists on getting a fresh haircut. You probably won't survive this. But rest assured, it won't matter much because you'll be asleep before we even get to the final chapter. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with your location and the time where you're tuning in from tonight. I'm always curious to know how far-reaching these little journeys are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, often portrayed as the epitome of strength, power, and military genius, had a surprising pre-battle routine. He would get a haircut. Now, before you start rolling your eyes at the idea of a leader worrying about such a trivial thing during a time of war, let's pause and think about it. There's more to this act than meets the eye. Napoleon's meticulous nature wasn't just about tactics on the battlefield. He understood the value of image and how a small detail like a neat, well-groomed appearance could project strength and control. You see, the man had an almost obsessive commitment to personal branding. While many generals were holed up in their tents poring over maps, Napoleon was ensuring that he looked the part of an unstoppable leader. Historians still argue whether his obsession with image detracted from his military strategy or if it was simply another facet of his genius. But one thing is certain. His image was as carefully crafted as his military strategies. Napoleon didn't just want to be a general, he wanted to be a legend, someone who was worshipped and feared in equal measure. And in those days, before the days of Instagram or Facebook profiles, image was everything. His daily routines were often carefully designed not just for effectiveness, but for the effect they would have on his men, his enemies, and the public. And let's be honest, Napoleon knew how to sell himself. Historians have pointed out that Napoleon's hairstyle became more than just a personal choice. It was a form of communication. The sharp, controlled look of his hair, always neatly trimmed, was an extension of his identity. It sent the message that Napoleon wasn't like the other generals, the ones who were too busy to care about such things. His attention to detail wasn't about vanity. It was about conveying an image of relentless control and invincibility. And let's face it, even in the midst of war, looking like you've got everything together counts for something. And so, we arrive at the haircut. As trivial as it might seem, this small act was symbolic. Napoleon's haircut before battle wasn't just for vanity. It was a ritual, a way for him to mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. It's rumored that on the eve of his major battles, when the future of his empire hung in the balance, he would sit still and have his hair trimmed to perfection. Think about that for a second. Amidst the hustle and tension of war, when everything else was chaos, Napoleon took the time to sit, relax, and get a fresh cut. He knew that, in the midst of all the noise and bloodshed, maintaining control over the small things could provide the calm he needed to face the larger battles. You might think it's a little overboard, but consider this. Napoleon's entire life was built on precision, on managing every detail, big or small, so that he could maintain that aura of invincibility. Imagine trying to lead an army into battle while worrying about your hair. it doesn't seem like the best idea. As Napoleon's career progressed, his image became almost as important as his battlefield strategies. And when you think about it, his haircut wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a carefully curated element of his brand, one that contributed to his broader efforts to control how others perceived him. His public image was that of a man who never faltered, never lost control, even when it seemed the odds were stacked against him. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's obsession with his appearance was a sign of vanity or a savvy understanding of leadership. After all, in those days, every move was scrutinized, and even the smallest detail could make or break a reputation. Napoleon was savvy enough to know that his personal appearance could boost morale among his soldiers or cause doubts among his enemies. A well-groomed, composed emperor would surely inspire more confidence than a disheveled, frantic one. As we move through this story, keep in mind that Napoleon's obsession with detail wasn't just about looking good. It was about making sure he appeared as untouchable as possible. Because, in the end, how you present yourself can say a lot about how you'll perform when the chips are down. When we think about Napoleon Bonaparte, we often imagine the grand victories, the grand speeches, and of course, the large, dramatic gestures that made him one of the most iconic figures in history. But here's the thing. His personal image was just as much a weapon as his cannons or battlefield tactics. And this brings us back to the small but telling detail of his haircut. Napoleon understood that it wasn't just about what he did on the battlefield. It was about what people saw and believed. His haircut, meticulously done before every battle, was a message that he was in control, poised, and ready for whatever challenge came next. This wasn't just vanity. Folks, this was strategy. Napoleon's emphasis on his appearance wasn't just limited to his hair, either. Everything about his look was designed with purpose, from his uniforms to his posture. He was a walking advertisement for power. Even his height, often noted as being shorter than the average Frenchman, became part of his image. He wore it with pride, often standing on ceremonial platforms to appear taller, projecting authority. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's complex about his height was a real issue for him, or if it was simply a part of the narrative he created to generate sympathy or to drive his enemies mad. Either way, his height didn't stop him from crafting an image that made him seem larger than life. You might be wondering, why did this matter so much to Napoleon? After all, he was one of the greatest military minds in history, with the battle plans to prove it. But think about it for a second. When you're leading an army, especially one as large and diverse as his, how you present yourself can impact everything. It's not just about tactical genius. It's about inspiration, morale. The way people perceive you directly affects how they follow you. Napoleon knew that. He understood that soldiers don't just fight for a general. They fight for someone they believe in, someone they admire. His image was part of the psychological warfare he waged. Now, let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Napoleon's ability to control his image extended beyond just looking good. It was a strategic tool that he wielded with as much precision as his battlefield maneuvers. For example, Napoleon knew the power of propaganda. He had a keen understanding of how to control public perception. During his rise to power, Napoleon used his image to portray himself as the savior of France, the man who would restore order after the chaos of the French Revolution. The fact that he looked like someone who could command respect wasn't incidental. It was a carefully constructed part of his appeal. His attention to his personal appearance sent the message that he was a man who could be trusted with power. And in an era when trust was everything, that mattered. Now, let's talk about his hair again. It wasn't just any old trim. It was a symbol. Napoleon was the emperor, and his appearance was a reflection of his authority. In fact, some people believed that Napoleon's haircuts were part of a larger ritual to mark the moments before the chaos of battle. There's a strange sort of rhythm to his routine, almost as if getting that perfect cut was like setting his mental gears into motion for the battle ahead. After all, if you're about to face an army, wouldn't you want to look and feel like the ultimate authority? Historians still argue whether this obsession with his image had any impact on his military success. On one hand, his iconic look likely helped him rally his troops, boosting morale and giving him an almost mythic presence. On the other hand, it's possible that his preoccupation with his public image led him to make some strategic miscalculations, distracting him from the realities of warfare. Was his personal vanity a sign of weakness or a sign of genius? The debate continues, and it's one that isn't easily settled. But let's zoom in on something else for a second: his troops. Napoleon was a master at maintaining the loyalty of his soldiers. It's said that part of his power was his ability to relate to them, to make them feel as though they were part of something larger than themselves. He didn't just sit in a castle issuing orders. He was out there, with his troops, often fighting alongside them. And in doing so, he fostered a sense of trust and camaraderie. But what about his image in front of them? It wasn't just about looking good. It was about conveying strength. Napoleon knew that how he presented himself had a direct effect on the morale of his army. Napoleon's efforts to maintain his image extended far beyond his personal appearance. He also cultivated a reputation for being a leader who understood the sacrifices his soldiers made. When a soldier was injured or died in battle, Napoleon often took the time to personally acknowledge their sacrifices, giving speeches that painted them as heroes for the cause. This was another piece of his branding, showing that he cared about each and every one of his soldiers, from the highest general to the lowest foot soldier. It wasn't just a PR stunt. It was a psychological tool he used to ensure loyalty. His troops were fighting not just for France, but for Napoleon himself. The haircut, then, fits neatly into this narrative. It wasn't just about his personal grooming. It was a ritual, a moment of calm before the storm of battle. It was Napoleon's way of showing that even in the most tumultuous of times, he could maintain control, and that his leadership was the anchor in a world full of chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a military genius, he was a master of managing his image. Picture the scene again. A massive, intimidating figure about to lead an army into a pivotal battle. And yet he takes time out to carefully arrange his appearance. A new haircut, a perfectly tailored uniform, every detail meticulously checked. Now, it might sound shallow, but Napoleon understood that his image, his very presence, was a weapon in and of itself. It was just as important as his army, his strategy, or his will to win. This obsession with his image wasn't born out of vanity. No, Napoleon wasn't just concerned with looking good for the sake of it. He knew how powerful perception could be, especially in a world where appearances often defined success or failure. To Napoleon, maintaining a well-groomed, polished appearance before battle was a demonstration of control. After all, if you could control how people saw you, You could control how they thought about you. And in Napoleon's world, how people thought about him could determine his empire's survival. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's obsession with his image ever interfered with his leadership. Was he so consumed by crafting the perfect public persona that he overlooked some of the more practical aspects of leadership? Or was his image an essential part of his success? Some suggest that Napoleon's visual power allowed him to inspire his troops, make himself an unassailable figure in the eyes of the French public, and perhaps even make his enemies doubt his potential for failure. Others believe that by focusing too much on appearance, he may have neglected deeper strategic concerns. But let's talk about the significance of Napoleon's brand. In his era, the idea of branding wasn't exactly a term in use, but that's essentially what he did. Through his appearance, speeches, and even his military tactics, Napoleon built a brand that was bigger than himself, a symbol of order, power, and triumph. Even his daily rituals, like the haircut, played into that branding. Napoleon wasn't just a man, he was a representation of a movement, an idea, an empire. But where does this leave us with the haircut? Well, think about it this way. The haircut wasn't just about looking presentable. It was about reinforcing Napoleon's image as a man who was always prepared, always in control. It's said that Napoleon would sometimes stand in front of his mirror before battle, adjusting his uniform, smoothing out wrinkles, and making sure his hair was perfectly styled. He had a routine, a sequence of actions that set his mind in order before the chaos of war. The ritual wasn't just a personal choice. It was an act of mental preparation, a way for him to transition from the normalcy of the everyday into the heightened state of readiness needed for battle. Let's take a step back for a second and consider how this ritual might have affected Napoleon's mindset. In times of high stress, say, on the eve of battle, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. The weight of an entire empire, thousands of lives, and a looming battle can certainly weigh heavily on anyone's shoulders. But Napoleon had a strategy for dealing with that stress, and it involved controlling the small things in his life. Getting a fresh haircut was his way of maintaining a sense of control in a world full of unpredictability. There's an interesting contrast here between the external and the internal. On the outside, Napoleon appeared calm, composed, and methodical. On the inside, however, the stakes were incredibly high, and he was under intense pressure. How could he maintain his focus with so much at risk? The answer, in part, lies in the way he handled stress. By focusing on the seemingly small and mundane task of getting a haircut, Napoleon created a sense of order in his own mind. Think about it this way. When you're faced with a difficult situation, whether it's a big presentation or an important decision, sometimes it helps to focus on the little things, the details. It's a way to take back control, even when everything else feels out of your hands. For Napoleon, this small ritual before battle was a way to give himself a psychological edge. By focusing on his appearance, he was taking control of the one thing he could in an uncertain world. Napoleon's soldiers certainly noticed this level of self-care. His grooming habits, the way he carried himself, the pride he took in his appearance, all contributed to the aura of invincibility that surrounded him. Soldiers were often inspired by their leader's confidence, which fed directly into their own morale. After all, who wouldn't be motivated by a leader who seemed completely assured, even when the odds were stacked against him? But there's more to the story than just appearances. Napoleon wasn't just about looks. He was about performance. And it's this combination of style and substance that made him such a compelling figure. His personal image wasn't just about drawing attention. It was about creating a narrative that reinforced his power and authority. And whether or not he knew it at the time, that narrative would be told for centuries to come, inspiring generations to study his every move. Historians still argue whether his attention to detail was a sign of brilliance or a flaw. Did it contribute to his meteoric rise, or eventually lead to his downfall? Some believe his obsession with his image was indicative of an emperor who could not escape the need to control every aspect of his life, even as the world around him crumbled. Others argue that it was simply another tool in his arsenal, a way to dominate the minds of his enemies, to make them question his limits and capabilities. Either way, Napoleon's attention to his image was undeniably a defining characteristic of his reign. He knew that the way he appeared in public, the way he projected himself, mattered just as much as his military strategy. And for a leader as ambitious and driven as Napoleon, maintaining a flawless image before battle was one of the many ways he solidified his control over his empire. Now that we've explored how Napoleon carefully crafted his personal image, let's take a moment to consider how that image was reflected within his army. Napoleon wasn't just a figurehead or an abstract symbol of power. He was actively involved in the daily lives of his soldiers, and his attention to detail didn't stop at his personal grooming. As the commander of the French army, he understood that his soldiers were the lifeblood of his empire, and their morale was just as critical to victory as any battlefield strategy. Napoleon's ability to maintain control over his soldiers went far beyond giving orders. It was about creating a sense of unity and loyalty that transcended the typical hierarchical structure of a military force. When it came to his troops, Napoleon knew how to balance respect and fear, making sure that his soldiers felt both awe and admiration for him. But why was it so important to him that his image was so carefully maintained? The answer lies in the role perception played within his army. Napoleon's soldiers didn't just see him as a leader, they saw him as a symbol. They believed in his invincibility, not just because of his military genius, but also because of how he presented himself. His physical appearance, well-groomed, composed, and confident, was a direct reflection of his inner strength and determination. Napoleon knew that in a time of war, where morale could make or break a campaign, maintaining an air of control was crucial to ensuring his soldiers remained dedicated and willing to fight. Historians still argue whether his image truly bolstered morale, or if it was the sheer effectiveness of his strategy that won them over. His ability to connect with his soldiers on a personal level was another key factor in this loyalty, while many commanders during the Napoleonic Wars remained distant from their troops. Napoleon frequently interacted with his men, speaking with them, sharing their hardships, and even fighting alongside them when necessary. He wanted them to believe in him, not just as a figurehead, but as someone who truly understood their struggles and hardships. This personal connection helped cultivate an environment of trust. And this trust was what ultimately motivated his army to fight so fiercely. Napoleon was also known for his ability to communicate his vision in a way that felt personal. He often used speeches, sometimes at night, addressing his men before key battles, emphasizing their role in the greater cause. His speeches would convey both his immense confidence in their abilities and his vision for a victorious future. And as they looked at him, perfectly groomed and sharp, the message was clear. Napoleon was someone who was ready to lead them to glory. They weren't just soldiers. They were part of a historical mission, and under his leadership, they believed they could accomplish the impossible. But what was it really like to be one of Napoleon's soldiers? Imagine being in the ranks of the Grande Armée, preparing for battle against some of Europe's most powerful forces. You've heard the stories of Napoleon's victories, and you know that the emperor himself often rides out to lead the charge. Then, on the eve of battle, you see him, clean, sharp, calm, standing there in full regalia, and when he speaks, it's not just a command, it's a promise. You believe in him. You fight not just for France, but for the image he has carefully cultivated, one of unwavering power and unshakable leadership. Now, let's talk about how Napoleon's influence didn't just extend to the French soldiers under his command, but also to the soldiers of his enemies. This, too, was a demonstration of the power of image. As we've discussed, Napoleon had a carefully constructed aura of invincibility. His opponents knew his reputation. They knew the stories of his military genius and how, time and again, he had defied the odds. This psychological warfare was a major part of his strategy. Imagine being on the opposing side of Napoleon's forces, preparing for battle. You know that your adversary is a man who pays meticulous attention to detail, who is almost obsessive about his image, and who leads an army of fervent, loyal soldiers. The fear and doubt this would instill in the minds of his enemies were significant. His carefully crafted persona wasn't just a tool for motivating his own troops. It was a weapon to weaken his enemies before the battle even began. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's psychological influence over his enemies was an intentional strategy or merely a byproduct of his personal charisma. Was he consciously using his image as a weapon? Or did it simply evolve as part of his larger persona? Some say that he never underestimated the importance of perception, while others believe it was just another aspect of his larger-than-life character. Either way, the psychological impact he had on those who faced him cannot be denied. This combination of physical image, strategic brilliance, and personal charisma created an aura around Napoleon that was nearly invincible. The soldiers in his ranks looked to him as a symbol of strength and hope, while his enemies often quaked in fear before the very thought of facing him. His haircut, along with the carefully crafted uniform, was a reminder to all that Napoleon was always in control, always prepared, and always a step ahead. As the Grand Army marched toward their next battle, Napoleon knew that his image would play a role in the outcome. Whether it was the appearance of invincibility that rallied his soldiers or the psychological pressure it placed on his enemies, Napoleon's public image was an essential part of his military success. And for the soldiers who followed him into battle, this careful grooming wasn't just about vanity. It was a visual reminder that they were part of something much larger than themselves. As Napoleon's empire grew, so did the legend that surrounded him. With each victory and each campaign, his image became more deeply intertwined with his identity as a military genius. The precision with which he operated on the battlefield, his calculated tactics, and his calculated appearance all reinforced this larger-than-life figure. The man who spent hours perfecting his appearance before each battle, standing tall, looking sharp, was, in a way, the perfect leader for an empire built on the principles of strength, control, and grandeur. But as we know, all great empires are eventually tested, and Napoleon's was no exception. So, let's talk about Napoleon's military strategy for a moment. What was it about his approach that made him so feared by his enemies? It wasn't just about brute force. Napoleon was a master of maneuver warfare. He understood that the battlefield was more than just a place of combat. It was a complex environment of shifting advantages, psychological pressure, and strategic deception. He didn't just aim to defeat his enemies. He sought to disorient them, confuse them, and outthink them at every turn. Napoleon's ability to read a battlefield and make decisions under pressure was unparalleled. But Napoleon also understood the value of speed. His armies were known for their mobility, their ability to strike quickly and decisively. He didn't waste time marching an army across miles of terrain. Instead, he focused on using his troops in a way that would allow them to outpace the enemy, striking when they least expected it. This strategy was central to many of his victories, especially during his early campaigns. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's reliance on speed and movement led to his downfall. While it allowed him to win many battles, it also left him overextended. His forces were stretched thin, and the logistics required to maintain such a fast-moving army were often unsustainable. The long supply lines became a burden as he pushed deeper into enemy territory, especially during the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. But before we dive into that chapter, let's take a moment to consider Napoleon's early career. His rise to power wasn't a sudden fluke. It was the result of a combination of military brilliance and his ability to seize opportunities. Born in Corsica, Napoleon was an outsider in many ways, yet he quickly adapted to the social and military structures of France. His military education, though not particularly prestigious at first, gave him a solid foundation. But it was his audacity and his natural tactical mind that allowed him to rise through the ranks so quickly. In the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon's talents as a military leader became apparent. As revolutionary France was besieged on all sides by foreign enemies, young Napoleon saw an opportunity to prove himself. By leading a successful campaign in Italy, he won the respect of his peers and the admiration of the French people. His innovative tactics and ability to think several steps ahead made him stand out. But it was his growing public image that helped solidify his rise to power. Napoleon's ability to take advantage of political instability also played a significant role in his ascent. As France was racked with revolution, Napoleon saw the shifting political landscape and maneuvered his way to power. He knew that his military victories alone wouldn't be enough to sustain him in the long term. He needed to consolidate his position. That's when he staged a coup in 1799, eventually leading to his rise as first consul, and later, as Emperor of France. And with his rise came an intense focus on his public image. Napoleon knew that he couldn't simply rely on military victories to maintain his position. He needed to cultivate a sense of awe and respect, not only from his soldiers, but also from the French populace and foreign powers. Every decision he made, from his uniforms to his speeches, was carefully calculated to reinforce the perception of power and invincibility. The same attention to detail that went into his haircuts before battle also applied to his imperial persona. Every detail mattered, from the way he spoke to the way he held himself. He was, after all, the Emperor of the French. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's obsession with his image was part of his genius or a dangerous flaw. On one hand, his image was a tool that allowed him to maintain control over his army and his empire. It helped him rally support, win loyalty, and intimidate his enemies. On the other hand, some believe that his constant need for approval and admiration may have contributed to his downfall. His public image became a double-edged sword. While it inspired loyalty, it also created an aura of arrogance and entitlement. In the end, it may have been this very arrogance that led to his undoing. But before we can fully understand how Napoleon's image and strategy collided in his eventual downfall, we must first look at one of his most iconic battles, the Battle of Austerlitz. This is the battle that cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest military tacticians. It was here that Napoleon's brilliant strategy, combined with his larger-than-life persona, would be tested against a coalition of Russia and Austria. Austerlitz, often called the Battle of the Three Emperors, was a defining moment for Napoleon. He faced a coalition army twice the size of his own. Yet he managed to outmaneuver and decisively defeat his enemies. The battle, fought in 1805, solidified his dominance over Europe and made him a legend in the eyes of both his supporters and his enemies. But as we'll see, even the greatest of victories can be fleeting. The lessons of Austerlitz would soon be overshadowed by his later mistakes. The Battle of Austerlitz, fought in December 1805, is often hailed as Napoleon's greatest victory. It wasn't just his tactical brilliance that made it remarkable. It was the way he turned the very psychology of warfare into an art form. Austerlitz was a textbook example of Napoleon's strategic genius, but it also demonstrated his ability to manipulate his image and the expectations of both his own troops and his enemies. Let's step onto the battlefield for a moment. Napoleon, with his smaller but highly trained forces, faced the combined armies of Russia and Austria. The odds were stacked against him. Yet, Napoleon had something his enemies didn't: the element of surprise. He allowed his forces to appear vulnerable, as if they were retreating, luring the coalition army into a false sense of security. His carefully cultivated persona of invincibility played into this. The opposing commanders believed that they were facing a weaker force, a military leader on the decline. But in reality, Napoleon was carefully orchestrating his forces, pulling them into a trap. The brilliance of Austerlitz lies not only in Napoleon's ability to outmaneuver his enemies, but in how he used the terrain to his advantage. He set up his forces on high ground, forcing the enemy to approach from a disadvantageous position. Then, at the perfect moment, he struck. Napoleon's forces swept in from the flanks, decisively destroying the center of the coalition army and turning the tide of the battle. The victory was absolute, leaving tens of thousands of enemy soldiers dead or captured. But what was even more impressive than the tactical execution was the psychological impact of the battle. Napoleon proved, once again, that he could outthink his enemies, anticipate their moves, and remain 3 steps ahead. For Napoleon, Austerlitz was a victory on multiple fronts. Not only did it solidify his military prowess, but it reinforced his image as a leader capable of overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds. To his troops, this was a moment of triumph that validated their belief in his invincibility. To his enemies, it was a humiliating defeat that further cemented Napoleon's reputation as the most dangerous military leader in Europe. Yet, while Austerlitz was a monumental success, it also marked the zenith of Napoleon's power. As we all know, the higher you rise, the further you have to fall. And as Napoleon's empire expanded, so did the pressures on him. His empire, which stretched across much of Europe, was an impressive feat of military strategy. But it also became a logistical nightmare. Napoleon's constant pursuit of dominance led to the expansion of his empire at a breakneck pace. But the resources needed to maintain control of such a vast territory proved unsustainable. It's in the aftermath of Austerlitz that we see the first cracks in Napoleon's carefully constructed image and strategy. His next major campaign, the invasion of Russia in 1812, would ultimately prove to be his undoing. The Russian campaign was a catastrophic failure, and it's often cited as the beginning of the end for Napoleon. But it wasn't just the military failure that contributed to his downfall. It was his inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was an act of overconfidence or a strategic miscalculation. Some believe that he underestimated the logistical challenges of invading such a vast and harsh land, while others argue that he was simply overextended, with too many enemies to fight on multiple fronts. Whatever the reason, the invasion ended in disaster. His forces, once so meticulously organized and disciplined, were ravaged by harsh winter conditions, disease, and starvation. The image of the great Napoleon, once so powerful and in control, was shattered as his army was decimated. So, what went wrong? It wasn't just the failed military campaign, it was the erosion of the very image that had made Napoleon so powerful. The man who had once seemed invincible now appeared vulnerable. His soldiers, who had once followed him with unwavering loyalty, began to question his judgment. The psychological edge he had once held over his enemies and his own men started to diminish. Napoleon's personal image, so carefully crafted over the years, began to unravel as his military fortunes turned. The Russian campaign marked a pivotal moment in Napoleon's life, and the effects of the failure rippled throughout his empire. His image as the supreme commander, the man who could do no wrong, was damaged beyond repair. His enemies, who had long feared him, now saw an opportunity to strike, and strike they did. What's fascinating here is the connection between Napoleon's image and his eventual downfall. Up until that point, his carefully maintained persona had been a source of power. But in the wake of the Russian disaster, that same persona became a liability. The myth of Napoleon, the invincible leader, was no longer sustainable. His failure in Russia exposed the vulnerabilities that had always existed beneath the surface of his empire. Historians still debate the psychological toll the Russian campaign had on Napoleon. Was he simply overconfident? Or did his obsession with maintaining his image prevent him from making more pragmatic decisions? One thing is certain. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon. His enemies, who had once seen him as a near mythical figure, now viewed him as a fallen leader. His carefully constructed image of invincibility crumbled as his military fortunes reversed. The emperor who had once conquered much of Europe was now in retreat, and with that, his public persona began to fade as well. Napoleon's retreat from Russia in 1812 was nothing short of disastrous. His once mighty army, which had marched triumphantly across Europe, was now reduced to a mere shadow of itself. Broken and decimated by the unforgiving Russian winter, the images of soldiers freezing, starving, and dying in the snow were a far cry from the proud, invincible force that had once marched under Napoleon's banner. This catastrophic defeat fundamentally altered the trajectory of Napoleon's empire and shattered the carefully cultivated persona that had made him the most feared and admired leader in Europe. As Napoleon withdrew from Russia, the losses were staggering. Of the 600,000 men who had initially marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back. The rest had perished in battle, from hunger or in the brutal cold. The defeat was so thorough that it sent shockwaves through the French Empire and left Napoleon vulnerable in a way he had never been before. But what's even more fascinating is how this failure impacted Napoleon's image, both within France and abroad. For years, Napoleon had been the epitome of strength, a figure who seemed invincible. His victories had seemed inevitable, his strategies flawless. But now, for the first time, his enemies were able to see that he, too, could be defeated. His image as an unstoppable force was cracked open, and the cracks widened with each passing day. As his army limped back home, so too did the myth of Napoleon's perfection. And this crack in his armor was something his enemies would exploit in the coming years. Interestingly, the image of Napoleon, the one that had once inspired such loyalty and awe, didn't disappear overnight. He still had a great deal of charisma, and many of his soldiers remained fiercely loyal. But now, the aura of invincibility that had once surrounded him began to fade, replaced by the realities of military failure. Napoleon was no longer seen as the infallible emperor, but as a man who had made a grave miscalculation, one that would cost him dearly. The loss in Russia, though devastating, was not the end of Napoleon's story, but it certainly marked the beginning of his downfall. In the years that followed, the European powers began to band together in an effort to bring him down. They sensed that his power was no longer unshakable, and they were quick to capitalize on the weakness exposed by the Russian campaign, one by one. Napoleon's allies deserted him, and the once mighty French Empire began to crumble under the weight of its own overextension. As Napoleon's empire began to unravel, his carefully curated image, his public persona, was no longer enough to hold everything together. The charisma that had once inspired an entire nation began to wane. Napoleon, who had once seemed untouchable, was now a figure in retreat. The psychological pressure on him must have been immense. His entire identity had been built on the idea of dominance, of control over both his empire and his image. Now, his image was shattered, and his control over his empire was slipping away. Historians still debate the extent to which Napoleon's obsession with his public persona played a role in his downfall. Some argue that it was his need to maintain an image of invincibility that blinded him to the realities of his military situation. His fixation on his public image may have led him to underestimate the challenges of his campaigns, pushing his army too far and too fast without regard for the long-term consequences. Others suggest that it was simply the weight of the empire he had created and the alliances he had forged that ultimately brought about his demise. Regardless of the cause, it is clear that the loss in Russia was a pivotal turning point in his reign, one that changed the course of European history. But it wasn't just military defeat that caused Napoleon's downfall. The psychological shift in how he was perceived played a significant role in his fall from power. For the first time, the French people began to see Napoleon as vulnerable. His image, which had once symbolized strength and invincibility, was now associated with failure and miscalculation. The public's perception of him began to shift, and with it, their support. His enemies, once wary of his power, began to see an opportunity. The very image that had once kept him at the top of European politics was now a liability. Napoleon's retreat from Russia set the stage for a series of defeats in the following years. The Battle of Leipzig in 1813, often called the Battle of Nations, saw Napoleon's forces decisively defeated by a coalition of European powers. The defeat left him with little more than a shattered reputation and an empire in disarray. His once unstoppable march across Europe had turned into a desperate retreat, and with every failure, his image became further tarnished. The culmination of these setbacks was Napoleon's first exile to the island of Elba in 1814. A man who had once ruled most of Europe now found himself in forced exile. a prisoner of the very forces he had once dominated. But even in exile, Napoleon's charisma never fully dissipated. In 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France for a brief period known as the 100 Days. His return was met with enthusiasm by many who had once followed him. But it was clear that his moment had passed. His brief resurgence ended in defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, after which he was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the final years of his life in isolation. While Napoleon's final days were marked by reflection and frustration, his legacy lived on. His image, once synonymous with power and glory, became a symbol of both greatness and hubris. He would forever be remembered as a man who conquered much of Europe, but ultimately could not conquer the limits of his own ambition. His story became one of caution, a reminder of how even the most carefully constructed images can be shattered by the harsh realities of fate. In the end, Napoleon's haircut, the simple act of grooming before battle, was more than just a personal ritual. It was a symbol of his control, his meticulous attention to detail, and his understanding of the power of perception. But as his empire crumbled, that image was no longer enough to sustain him. The man who had once seemed invincible became a tragic figure, a cautionary tale of how the pursuit of power and the need to control one's image can lead to destruction. Napoleon's downfall was marked not only by military defeats, but by the collapse of the very image that had once made him one of the most powerful and iconic figures in history. His story serves as a striking reminder of the fragility of public perception and how easily an image, no matter how carefully crafted, can shatter when faced with overwhelming reality. The fall of Napoleon Bonaparte was, in many ways, a tale of a man who had built an empire not just with his armies, but with his public persona, a persona that eventually betrayed him. His exile to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, marked the final chapter of Napoleon's life. There, far from the battlefields of Europe, Napoleon was forced to confront the realities of his situation. His once grand empire was gone, and with it, the persona he had so carefully maintained. In his isolation, Napoleon had time to reflect on his life and his failures. And even as he did, his image continued to evolve. No longer the commanding emperor, Napoleon became a tragic figure, a fallen leader who had reached the pinnacle of power only to see it slip through his fingers. Interestingly, despite his fall from grace, Napoleon's image continued to exert a significant influence, both in France and across Europe. His time on St. Helena was filled with attempts to rewrite his legacy. He knew that his story, like his image, would be shaped by those who told it. And so, he worked to ensure that his version of events, one where he was a great and misunderstood hero, would be the one remembered. His letters and memoirs, written during his exile, sought to present him as a victim of fate, a man who had been betrayed by those closest to him, a leader who had been forced into war by the actions of his enemies. Historians still argue about how much of Napoleon's own account of his life should be trusted. Was he simply rewriting his own history to salvage his reputation? Or was he genuinely trying to explain the complexities of his decisions and actions? Regardless, his attempts to control his narrative only reinforced the idea that, even in exile, Napoleon was still trying to manage his image. But this time, the image he tried to project was one of a man who had been misunderstood, a victim of forces beyond his control. In some ways, Napoleon's exile and subsequent death in 1821 only cemented his legendary status. As the years went by, The memory of his rule and his image began to evolve into something mythic. His image transformed from that of a power-hungry dictator to a complex, almost tragic figure who had brought revolution and change to Europe. His military genius was still acknowledged, but his ambition and eventual downfall became a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris. It was in this new narrative that Napoleon found a kind of immortality. By the time of his death, Napoleon had gone from being a man whose image was synonymous with invincibility to a figure whose story encapsulated both greatness and tragedy. The man who had once meticulously crafted every detail of his public persona, including his haircut before battle, had now become a symbol of the fleeting nature of power. His story continued to resonate with people across the world, serving as a reminder of the cost of ambition, the price of overreach, and the eventual fragility of even the most carefully constructed empires. Napoleon's return to France in 1815 during the 100 Days was brief, but it did reveal something critical about the hold he still had on the French people. Even after his dramatic defeat at Waterloo, many rallied to his side, showing that his image, though damaged, had not entirely dissipated. This final burst of support during his return to power spoke volumes about the lasting impact of his persona. For many, Napoleon represented more than just a leader. He embodied an ideal of strength, vision, and action. It's no surprise that even in the face of defeat, some were still willing to follow him. Yet, despite the brief resurgence of support, the final blow came with his ultimate exile to St. Helena, where Napoleon was left to fade away in isolation. His empire, once vast and all-encompassing, was gone, and his carefully curated image, once so commanding and omnipresent, was now nothing more than a fading memory. His final years were spent contemplating his legacy, but by then, it was too late to undo the cracks that had appeared in his image. Still, Napoleon's legacy endures in a way that many other historical figures do not. His story continues to captivate people's imaginations, not just because of his military victories or his grandiose ambitions, but because of the complexity of his character. He wasn't just a ruthless conqueror. He was a man who understood the importance of his image, who worked tirelessly to craft a persona that would last for generations. And even after his downfall, that image continued to be shaped, redefined, and immortalized by historians, writers, and artists. Historians still argue about what truly led to Napoleon's downfall. Was it his obsession with power and control, his overconfidence in his own invincibility, or was it simply the weight of an empire that had grown too large to sustain? Some argue that it was the personal flaws, his need for constant validation, and the meticulous construction of his public persona that led to his undoing. Others believe it was the relentless demands of empire building that eventually stretched his resources too thin. What's certain is that Napoleon's rise and fall were deeply intertwined with his image. And so, as we reflect on Napoleon's life, it's clear that the haircut before battle wasn't just a trivial detail. It was part of a larger narrative, a carefully constructed image that, for a time, defined an era. Napoleon's attention to his appearance, to the way he presented himself to the world, was a key element of his strategy, and it played a critical role in his success. But in the end, it was his inability to maintain that image, and the collapse of the empire that he had worked so hard to build, that led to his downfall. And yet, his story lives on, as one of the most fascinating and complex chapters in the history of Europe. As Napoleon's life draws to its final chapters, It's clear that his image, his persona, was as important to his legacy as any of his military victories. In the years after his death, the legend of Napoleon grew, transforming him into a symbol of both triumph and tragedy. The complexity of his character, the way he built an empire, maintained his image, and ultimately watched it crumble, has left a lasting impression on the world. After his death on St. Helena in 1821, Napoleon became the subject of a historical narrative that sought to reconcile the many contradictions of his life. Was he a hero or a villain? A visionary leader who brought Europe into a new age? Or a man whose boundless ambition led him down a path of destruction? Historians still debate these questions, but one thing is certain: Napoleon's influence didn't die with him. The image of Napoleon as a genius military strategist, a man who revolutionized warfare and led an empire to its heights, remains a dominant part of his legacy. However, as time passed, Napoleon's character was also reshaped by the lens through which he was viewed. To some, he was a tragic figure, a man who overreached and ultimately fell from grace. To others, he remained the embodiment of strength, determination, and leadership. Napoleon's image was further solidified by the ways in which he became part of French culture and identity. The very image of Napoleon, his sharp uniform, his resolute stance, the meticulous grooming and attention to detail, has been immortalized in paintings, sculptures, and literature. These depictions, often romanticized, continue to shape our perception of him. In this sense, his image transcended the man himself, becoming a symbol not just of military prowess, but of an era. In France, Napoleon's legacy was both celebrated and critiqued. During the reign of Napoleon III, his nephew, the second French emperor, worked to reclaim Napoleon's image as a source of national pride. Public monuments were built, and his achievements were glorified in an effort to inspire a new generation of French citizens. The iconic image of Napoleon, his hand tucked into his jacket, became an enduring symbol of his reign and his influence on French history. Historians, however, continue to debate whether Napoleon's obsessive attention to his image was ultimately his greatest strength or his most fatal flaw. Was it his calculated presentation of himself as a figure of invincibility that allowed him to inspire so many? Or was it this same image that prevented him from seeing the true limitations of his power, blinding him to the risks of overextending his empire? Some scholars argue that had Napoleon been less concerned with his public persona, he might have made different, more prudent choices. But then, perhaps without his ability to project such confidence, his rise to power would have been impossible. Regardless of the debates, what stands out is that Napoleon's image, carefully constructed through both action and appearance, became inseparable from his identity. His haircut before battle, a seemingly trivial detail, was emblematic of this. Every aspect of his presentation was deliberate, a small piece of the larger image he wanted to project to the world. And while his downfall was dramatic, the very fact that his image has endured for nearly 2 centuries speaks volumes about the lasting power of his persona. But it wasn't just his image that defined Napoleon's legacy. It was the impact he had on Europe and the world. His reforms, the Napoleonic Code, and his influence on modern military strategy have left an indelible mark on history. Napoleon reshaped Europe in ways that are still felt today. His empire, though short-lived, set the stage for the modern nation-state, and his legal reforms became the foundation for many European legal systems. His influence was far-reaching, and it transcended the borders of his empire. Napoleon's strategic genius, though often overshadowed by his personal ambition, remains one of the most studied aspects of his legacy. His understanding of military tactics, his ability to mobilize and manage large forces, and his innovations in warfare changed the course of history. And yet, as we've seen, his military genius was closely tied to his ability to manage his image. It was his charismatic leadership and the aura of invincibility that inspired loyalty from his soldiers and fear from his enemies. It was his image that made him larger than life, and it was that same image that ultimately crumbled when he faced the harsh realities of war. Historians still argue whether Napoleon's downfall was inevitable or the result of a series of miscalculations. Perhaps it was the combination of his unrelenting ambition, his desire to control every aspect of his image, and his inability to see the limits of his empire that brought him down. Maybe it was simply the weight of his own success. An empire so vast, so stretched, that it could not possibly be sustained. In the end, it's likely a bit of both. What remains clear, however, is that Napoleon's life and legacy are inextricably linked to the image he built and the empire he created. His obsession with maintaining control over how he was perceived, whether through his sharp uniforms, his carefully maintained haircuts, or his speeches to his troops, shaped the way he was remembered. And in the end, it was his image that lived on, even as his empire crumbled to dust. Napoleon's story is not just one of military conquests, but of image, ambition, and the inevitable limits of power. His rise to greatness, his careful cultivation of his public persona, and his dramatic fall from power remind us that even the most carefully constructed empires and images can be undone by forces beyond our control. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. As we now reflect on the final days of Napoleon's reign and legacy, it's important to pause and consider the lasting impact he had on both France and the world. After his defeat at Waterloo, he was once again exiled, this time to the isolated island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remainder of his life. It was on this remote island, far from the grand courts of Europe, that Napoleon would face the harshest form of exile, not just physical isolation, but the slow erosion of the grand image he had so carefully crafted over the years. Yet, even in his exile, Napoleon's obsession with maintaining his image persisted. The man who once commanded entire armies and vast empires now found himself confined to a small island, but his mind never stopped working. He spent his days reflecting on his life, attempting to rewrite his history, and projecting an image of himself that would survive long after his death. It's said that he spent hours dictating his memoirs, meticulously crafting the narrative of his rise to power and his eventual fall, painting himself as a misunderstood genius, a victim of fate. This desire to control his legacy, to present himself as a tragic yet noble figure, was yet another extension of his obsession with image. Historians still debate the accuracy of these memoirs. Was Napoleon simply crafting a self-serving narrative? Or was he genuinely attempting to make sense of the life he had lived and the empire he had lost? What's clear is that Napoleon's final years on St. Helena were marked by an intense need to maintain control over how history would view him. His image, his carefully constructed persona, was now his last means of power. It was the only thing he could still influence. Napoleon's exile marked the beginning of a fascinating shift in how he was perceived. During his reign, he had been a figure of absolute power, an emperor who commanded both the battlefield and the hearts of his people. But after his fall, his image transformed from one of invincibility to one of a tragic heroic figure. This shift began during his time on St. Helena, where his isolation allowed for reflection, but it grew stronger in the decades after his death. Even after his passing, Napoleon's image continued to evolve. Initially, his downfall was viewed with a sense of finality, the inevitable result of his overreach and ambition. However, as time passed, a different narrative began to take shape. Napoleon was increasingly seen as a figure who had, in his own way, brought about meaningful change, his military genius and his reforms. Most notably, the Napoleonic Code, which influenced legal systems across Europe, remained central to his legacy. The military tactics he pioneered are still studied at military academies around the world, and his impact on the modern state is undeniable. But it wasn't just his military prowess or legal contributions that kept Napoleon's image alive. The way he maintained control over his persona, even in the face of exile and defeat, became a source of fascination. His image evolved into a symbol of ambition and hubris, a leader who had risen to the heights of power, but ultimately fell victim to his own greatness. Napoleon's story became a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, but also a tribute to the power of an indomitable will. This mythic quality of Napoleon's image is what makes his legacy so enduring. Even those who view him critically often acknowledge his sheer determination, his ability to shape the world around him, and his relentless drive to maintain control over his image and his empire. In a sense, Napoleon became a symbol of the modern man, a figure who understood the importance of perception, of public image, and the influence that one's reputation can have on the course of history. And as his story continued to unfold in the public imagination, the image of the great military leader who had once carefully groomed himself before battle became a symbol of both his strength and his vulnerability. The myth of Napoleon was not just about his victories, it was about his fall, his struggle to maintain his image, and the way he shaped his own legacy in the face of defeat. It's this paradox, the invincible conqueror who became a tragic figure, that makes his story so compelling and timeless. By the time of his death in 1821, Napoleon had already achieved a certain level of immortality. His image, though tarnished by his defeat at Waterloo and the loss of his empire, continued to endure. In France, Napoleon was seen not just as an emperor, but as a national hero, a man who had fought for the glory of his country, who had brought France to the forefront of European power. And as the years went on, Napoleon's legacy was only solidified further. Monuments were erected in his honor, streets were named after him, and his life was chronicled in countless books, films, and paintings. One of the most fascinating aspects of Napoleon's legacy is how his image has continued to evolve in the modern world. In many ways, he has become a symbol not just of military brilliance, but of the modern desire for power and control over one's own destiny. In a world where the image you project can shape the way people perceive you, Napoleon's life serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. His ability to craft and maintain his public persona, to shape the narrative of his life even in the face of defeat, is something that resonates with many leaders today. Historians still debate Napoleon's legacy, and it's likely that his story will continue to be reassessed for generations to come. Some will focus on his military brilliance, others on his personal flaws, and still others on his relentless pursuit of power. But one thing is certain: Napoleon's image, and the story he created around it, will remain one of the most compelling and complex narratives in the history of Europe. And so, As we finish our journey through the curious case of Napoleon's haircut before his big battle, we are left with an image of a man who understood the power of perception. A man who carefully crafted every detail of his public persona, from the way he stood to the way he groomed himself. In the end, his image lived on long after the empire he built crumbled. Napoleon's story is not just about a man's rise and fall. It's about how a carefully crafted image can shape history, for better or worse. As we now approach the final stages of Napoleon's remarkable and complex journey, it's important to step back and appreciate how his story and the image he carefully constructed continue to impact the world today. Napoleon was a man who mastered the art of leadership, not just with his brilliant military strategies, but also through an almost instinctive understanding of how perception could shape the outcomes of battles, politics, and even history itself. His life and legacy are a study in the intersection of image, power, and ambition, a story that endures through time. After Napoleon's exile to St. Helena and his subsequent death in 1821, the myth of Napoleon was far from over. In fact, it was during these posthumous years that the true transformation of his image began. During his lifetime, he had been a leader, an emperor, a conqueror. But after his death, he became something much larger, a symbol, a legend. Even in exile, he never stopped shaping the narrative of his life. From the isolated confines of St. Helena, Napoleon remained in the public eye through the letters he wrote, the memoirs he dictated, and the constant attempts to control the way history would judge him. But Napoleon's image, like any myth, was malleable. And as time passed, different generations would shape and reshape the way he was viewed. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the French people were left to deal with the loss of an emperor who had been both a hero and a tyrant. Yet even in the wake of his fall, there was an undeniable reverence for his contributions. His reforms, most notably the Napoleonic Code, remained deeply embedded in European legal systems, cementing his legacy as a lawgiver whose influence surpassed the military sphere. But Napoleon's image wasn't just built on legal reforms or military victories. It was equally shaped by his public persona. In the years following his death, the image of Napoleon would undergo a fascinating evolution. His once unquestioned authority on the battlefield and as the Emperor of France now had to contend with the failures of his later years. The narrative of his exile, his defeat at Waterloo, and the fall of his empire all added layers of complexity to the story of his life. Yet, despite these setbacks, Napoleon's image remained remarkably resilient. Historians still grapple with the question, was Napoleon a tragic figure, doomed by his own ambition, or was he a visionary who, despite his flaws, brought about lasting change? Some view him as a hero who gave his life in service to France, while others see him as an arrogant dictator who pushed his empire and his image too far. This debate, more than 200 years after his death, speaks to the enduring nature of his legacy. In France, his image was reshaped not just by historians, but by the very political currents that had swept through the country during and after his reign. During the era of Napoleon III, his nephew, the second French emperor, worked diligently to revive his uncle's legacy, even going so far as to construct monuments and name streets in Napoleon's honor. This effort to elevate Napoleon to a heroic status was an attempt to bring stability and pride back to a France that had been rocked by revolution and defeat. It was in this period that Napoleon became enshrined as a national icon, a figure of both glory and inevitability. Yet, as Napoleon's legacy evolved, so did the public's perception of him. Over time, many of the criticisms of his reign, his authoritarian rule, his relentless ambition, his wars of conquest, became part of the story that people told about him. And in that process, Napoleon became a figure not just to admire, but also to caution against. His rise to power, his ability to manipulate his image, and the collapse of his empire became a symbol of both human potential and human limitation. As the years passed, Napoleon's image continued to take on new layers. In the 19th and 20th centuries, his legacy would become part of the broader story of the French Revolution, where he was often portrayed as the inevitable outcome of the revolution's radical ideas. While some viewed Napoleon as a usurper who betrayed the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, others saw him as a necessary force to stabilize France and bring order to a country torn apart by revolution. Today, Napoleon's image remains as powerful and as contradictory as ever. On the one hand, he is still seen as a brilliant military strategist, a leader who revolutionized modern warfare. His influence on military tactics, the organization of armies, and the conduct of war continues to be studied by military leaders and historians. On the other hand, he is also remembered as a man whose imperial ambitions led to the destruction of much of Europe and the deaths of millions. The paradox of Napoleon, the genius who built an empire and the man whose flaws led to its collapse, continues to fascinate. In pop culture, Napoleon's image has been reimagined countless times. From films to books, his life has inspired countless retellings, each one offering a new interpretation of his character. Sometimes he is portrayed as the archetypal tragic hero, a man whose ambition led him to greatness, only to destroy him in the end. Other times, he is depicted as a visionary, a man who sought to reshape the world and, in doing so, left an indelible mark on history. No matter how he is portrayed, the image of Napoleon remains a powerful and compelling one, a figure who encapsulates both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human folly. So, as we close the book on this journey through the curious case of Napoleon's haircut before his big battle, it's clear that his story isn't just about one man's rise and fall. It's about how an image, carefully crafted and meticulously maintained, can transcend time. It's about how perception and power are intertwined, and how even the smallest of details, the way a man wears his hair before battle, can become a symbol of something much larger. Napoleon's story is one that continues to captivate us. The man who conquered much of Europe, who built an empire on the power of his image and his ambition, left a legacy that endures in ways that go far beyond his military exploits. His haircut, his uniform, his posture, all of these elements combined to create the image of a man who seemed untouchable. And in the end, that image, like the empire he built, would be tested, eroded, and ultimately transformed, but never forgotten. Napoleon Bonaparte's legacy, though rooted in his military genius and the empire he built, is as much about the myth that surrounds him as it is about his actual achievements. The Napoleon that history remembers is not just the man who conquered Europe or the brilliant tactician who won countless battles. It is also the symbol of both greatness and downfall, of ambition unchecked, and of a man whose very image became an instrument of power. His rise to prominence, his obsessive control over his image, and his eventual downfall are all pieces of a larger story that speaks to the fragility of power, the volatility of perception, and the delicate balance between image and reality. Napoleon's story is defined not just by his military triumphs and his empire building, but by how he used his personal image to rally support, inspire loyalty, and intimidate enemies. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of presentation. He knew that every gesture, every uniform, every appearance before the troops, and, yes, every carefully prepared haircut, could communicate power and control. In a way, Napoleon's image was as much a weapon as his army, his cannons, or his battlefield strategies. In fact, his understanding of the role of perception in shaping history is a lesson that still resonates today. His obsession with controlling how he was seen by both allies and enemies was a crucial element in his success. During his reign, his carefully crafted persona projected invincibility, authority, and charisma. This image inspired the loyalty of his soldiers and the admiration of the French people. It also frightened his enemies, many of whom saw him as an unstoppable force. This self-made image, one that combined meticulous grooming, a commanding presence, and strategic brilliance, was so tightly woven into his identity that it became inseparable from the man himself. But as his empire expanded, so too did the dangers of relying so heavily on his image. The same qualities that made him a brilliant leader also became the seeds of his downfall. Napoleon's fixation on power, control, and maintaining a perfect public image led to overextension, both militarily and politically. The more he sought to project invincibility, the more vulnerable he became. His greatest military triumphs were followed by his most disastrous defeats, and his image, once untouchable, became a double-edged sword. The failure of his Russian campaign in 1812 exposed the limits of his power and the fragility of the image he had carefully constructed. The once mighty emperor, who had once stood tall in the face of Europe's greatest powers, now found himself retreating across the frozen Russian landscape with a shattered army. The very thing that had propelled him to greatness, his image of invincibility, was now a symbol of hubris. And yet, even in defeat, Napoleon's image remained potent. His legend didn't die with his army. Instead, it evolved, as legends often do, growing more complex and multifaceted with time. When Napoleon was exiled to the island of St. Helena, his image, though tarnished, did not vanish. His life became a subject of fascination and reinterpretation, as he continued to shape the narrative of his downfall. The man who had once been the embodiment of control and power now found himself in a position where he could only influence history through his words and his writings. It was here, in his final years, that Napoleon crafted his memoirs, attempting to portray himself not as a fallen emperor, but as a misunderstood hero, a man who had been wronged by fate and his enemies. Historians still debate whether these memoirs are a genuine attempt at self-examination or a calculated effort to control the way he would be remembered. Regardless, they show us how deeply tied his image was to his identity, even in the face of his defeat. Napoleon's memoirs, written in exile, became a tool through which he continued to manipulate his public perception. Even from the confines of St. Helena, Napoleon sought to rewrite the story of his life, presenting himself as a leader who had been betrayed, a man who had been forced into wars that had ultimately led to his downfall. In these memoirs, Napoleon cast himself as a tragic figure, one whose ambition had been noble, but whose downfall was the result of external forces. This narrative, though self-serving, was effective in ensuring that Napoleon's image would remain, if not untarnished, then at least reshaped in a way that would allow his legacy to persist. As the years went by, Napoleon's image continued to evolve, taking on new meanings and interpretations. His influence as a military leader, his contribution to legal reforms, and his role in shaping modern Europe ensured that his story remained a subject of interest for future generations. His military strategies are still studied in military academies around the world. His Napoleonic Code continues to serve as the foundation for legal systems in numerous countries, and his influence on the idea of the modern state remains undeniable. But it wasn't just his contributions to law and warfare that ensured Napoleon's place in history. It was also the way he became a symbol of both greatness and tragedy. The man who once ruled much of Europe and whose very presence commanded armies was now reduced to a figure of mythic proportions. Napoleon, the man, may have been exiled and forgotten by some, but his image lived on, an enduring symbol of ambition, power, and the price of overreach. Napoleon's image was a carefully constructed facade that, for many years, held up under the pressure of his victories. Yet, in the end, it was that very image that became his undoing. The obsession with maintaining the illusion of invincibility led him to make choices that ultimately led to his downfall. His public persona, once a source of immense power, became a burden, and the emperor, who had once controlled every aspect of his image, was now a prisoner of his own ambition. And yet, even in his final years, Napoleon continued to shape his legacy. His life, his rise, and his fall became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the fragility of power, and the limits of even the greatest leaders. Napoleon's story reminds us that, in the end, our images, no matter how carefully constructed, can be shattered by forces beyond our control. But perhaps, like Napoleon, we can continue to shape how we are remembered, even when everything else is lost. Now, as we approach the final leg of our journey through Napoleon Bonaparte's curious case, it's essential to pause and look beyond the man and his empire. The impact of his life, both during and after his reign, extends far beyond the battles he fought or the empire he built. Napoleon's image, the way he maintained control over his public persona, is a story about how powerful a single figure's influence can be, not just in military or political terms, but in shaping the very fabric of society and history. Napoleon's life, and more specifically, his image, has been subject to constant reinterpretation. Throughout history, figures of power like Napoleon have been transformed into symbols. And often these symbols are shaped more by what we want to see than by the actual truth of their lives. The image of Napoleon that was constructed by him, and later by those who came after him, is a perfect example of how an individual's identity can be transformed by time, perspective, and the changing tides of political thought. What we see today is a complex image of Napoleon that is part hero, part villain, a man who sought to reshape the world and whose ambition ultimately led to both the greatness and collapse of his empire. This image wasn't just the result of what Napoleon did in the public eye, but of how his story was told after his downfall. After Napoleon's defeat and exile, the way history treated his legacy shifted dramatically. In France, particularly, his image was carefully curated by those who wished to maintain his memory and perhaps revive a sense of national pride. Napoleon's nephew, Napoleon III, used his uncle's legacy to bolster his own rule, using the image of the great Emperor Napoleon to justify his own empire. Monuments were erected, streets were named after him, and an entire generation grew up with the belief that Napoleon was, in some sense, an enduring symbol of French glory. Even after Napoleon III's fall from power, the legend of his uncle remained. Napoleon's persona has since become so enmeshed with the French identity that it can be hard to separate the man from the symbol. His victories, the Napoleonic Code, and the reforms he put in place continue to influence the legal and political frameworks of modern societies. He reshaped Europe in ways that are still felt today. His efforts in centralizing the administration of France, his development of a modernized legal system, and his push for merit-based advancement all had lasting consequences. But all these contributions were woven into the legend of Napoleon as the great emperor, the master of war and of law. Yet the complexity of his image comes from the tension between the myth and the reality. There are many who view Napoleon's reign through a lens of cautious reverence, recognizing both his achievements and his flaws. His image, like that of many larger-than-life historical figures, is complex and filled with contradictions. For some, he was a liberator who brought order and reform. For others, he was a tyrant whose ambitions cost millions of lives and whose imperial drive destabilized Europe for generations. Historians still debate whether Napoleon was a man who genuinely believed in the ideals of the revolution, or whether he simply used those ideals as a means to justify his power. Was his reign a continuation of the revolution, or was it an abandonment of its principles? These questions remain central to our understanding of Napoleon's legacy, and they also inform how we perceive his image. Napoleon's identity as both the liberator of Europe and the embodiment of revolutionary ideals can coexist with the image of the autocratic ruler who sought to rule Europe by force. The contrast is not just historical, but ideological, and it continues to shape the way we see him today. When it comes to his military legacy, the story is equally nuanced. Napoleon's campaigns were legendary, not just for their tactical brilliance, but for the sheer scale of ambition they represented. His military genius was undeniable. His ability to rapidly mobilize troops, create innovative battle strategies, and decisively win against superior forces has earned him a place among the greatest military commanders in history. But his relentless ambition also led to overreach. His invasion of Russia, his defeat at Leipzig, and the eventual collapse of his empire are a stark reminder of the limits of even the greatest military minds. Napoleon, the strategist who seemed so invincible, was ultimately undone by the very empire he had built. His image as the eternal conqueror falters when we look at these failures. But this duality is precisely what makes Napoleon such a fascinating historical figure. The very same traits that made him successful, the audacity, the risk-taking, the focus on personal image, also made him vulnerable. His downfall was inextricably tied to his obsession with control, both over his empire and his image. The public figure of Napoleon, who stood tall before battle and was so sure of his own invincibility, had, in the end, underestimated the costs of his own overconfidence. But even as his empire collapsed, Napoleon remained an icon, the subject of fascination and myth-making. His exile on St. Helena did not erase his presence from the public consciousness. Instead, it made his story more tragic, more heroic, more compelling. He became, in many ways, a symbol of the human condition, capable of achieving greatness, but also prone to overreach and destruction. The very fact that Napoleon continued to exert influence from his place of exile, shaping his own narrative through memoirs, letters, and reflections, demonstrates the enduring power of his image. He may have lost his empire, but his ability to control his legacy was as strong as ever. In the years following his death, Napoleon's image would evolve again. And this time, it would be a part of a broader narrative of European nationalism. In many ways, the figure of Napoleon became a symbol of the power of the individual, his ability to transcend his origins, create an empire, and shape history. But it also became a cautionary tale of the limits of ambition, the cost of personal and political hubris, and the inevitable fall from grace. Napoleon's story continues to captivate and instruct, his image enduring through the ages as a reminder of both human greatness and human fragility. Napoleon's haircuts, those seemingly trivial moments before the chaos of battle, now take on new meaning. They represent more than just vanity. They are a microcosm of the larger, deeply human story of image, power, and destiny. Napoleon, the master of self-presentation, knew the importance of the details, and in those final touches of grooming, he constructed not just a battle-ready look, but an image that would outlast the empire he so carefully built. As we draw closer to the end of our journey, it's impossible not to reflect on how deeply Napoleon's image has infiltrated both the historical narrative and popular culture. While his empire fell long ago, Napoleon's story continues to resonate because of the complexities surrounding his character, his rise, and ultimately, his fall. What started as a carefully curated image of invincibility and military genius has evolved into a symbol of both the heights of human ambition and the perils of unchecked power. The tale of Napoleon's image, much like his empire, is filled with paradoxes, strength and vulnerability, confidence and arrogance, brilliance and overreach. The way Napoleon presented himself, his meticulous grooming, his precise military strategies, his calculated moves to control how he was seen by his enemies and supporters alike, was instrumental in crafting the aura of greatness that surrounded him. Even in his darkest moments, particularly during his exile, Napoleon continued to shape how he would be remembered. His letters, memoirs, and even his reflections on the nature of power all served to reinforce his legacy. They showed that, even in the face of defeat, he remained a master of self-presentation, much like he had been during his rise to power. What is most fascinating about Napoleon's image, though, is its resilience. Even in the aftermath of his final defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's legend did not fade away. His image, carefully shaped throughout his life, transformed into a symbol of both tragic heroism and undying ambition. It's almost as if Napoleon, through the control of his narrative, found a way to transcend the very limitations of his empire. He may have lost his battles and his throne, but his image became immortal, as enduring as the history books that recount his rise and fall. As Napoleon's empire crumbled, the image of the man who once ruled it all became ever more significant. What was once seen as a powerful, decisive ruler became a reflection of the fragility of power itself. Historians, writers, and even the public would come to view him as more than just a man of war. He became a symbol of ambition, hubris, and the inevitable downfall of those who reached too far. His life and his image continued to captivate because they mirrored human nature itself. The pursuit of greatness, the need for control, and the inescapable vulnerability that comes with any empire. And yet, the paradox of Napoleon's image remains. Even as his power faded, his legacy grew. While he had once constructed his empire on the basis of military might and personal authority, His most enduring legacy came to be his role as a symbol of both the triumphs and the tragedies of human ambition. Napoleon became not just a historical figure, but an idea, a complex, multifaceted symbol that transcends time and place. Napoleon's image has been woven into the fabric of European and global culture in ways that no one could have predicted when he first rose to power. His influence extends far beyond the military realm. It touches law, politics, and even art. The Napoleonic Code, which he instituted as part of his legal reforms, became the foundation for legal systems in many countries, leaving a lasting imprint on governance. His approach to leadership, his insistence on meritocracy over aristocratic privilege, and his centralized vision of government shaped not just the politics of France, but the structure of modern states around the world. These lasting contributions are as much a part of his legacy as his battlefield tactics. The image of Napoleon has also been shaped by countless works of art, literature, and media. From paintings of him in heroic poses to modern depictions in films and books. His figure has been rendered in every conceivable way, each portrayal contributing to his larger-than-life status. This ongoing representation in popular culture, alongside the continued study of his life, ensures that his image remains dynamic, capable of adapting to changing historical perspectives. Napoleon, the general, the emperor, the exile, the man of myth, continues to be reshaped to fit the moment. His story, woven with both extraordinary triumphs and extraordinary failures, serves as a canvas on which the world paints its understanding of power, ambition, and the human condition. Even today, we still refer to Napoleonic qualities: strategic genius, ambition, an almost obsessive attention to detail when describing certain leaders or figures in politics and business. His ability to manipulate his own public image, particularly his commanding presence and meticulous grooming, is often cited as one of the key factors in his success. As we consider the current world, we recognize how much Napoleon's image can still speak to the influence of personal branding in leadership and in the manipulation of public perception. What's perhaps most remarkable is that Napoleon's story has outlived him by more than 2 centuries. Even as political regimes have come and gone, even as the world has moved into entirely new eras, Napoleon's image remains a central part of how we think about power, leadership, and legacy. His rise and fall, his precise control over his image, his remarkable tactical mind, and his eventual undoing serve as timeless reminders of the heights one can reach and the depths one can fall. As we close our exploration of Napoleon's legacy, it's clear that his story is far from simple. It's a tale of ambition, image, and the fragility of power. Napoleon crafted an empire, but it was the image he built around it, his public persona, that truly defined his reign. His ability to maintain control over his own narrative, even in defeat, ensured that his legacy would endure long after the last battle had been fought. Napoleon's haircut before battle, a seemingly small detail, was more than just about vanity. It was part of the larger framework of his carefully curated image, a symbol of control, a sign of preparedness, and ultimately, a reminder of how deeply image and identity are tied to the forces of history. Napoleon's story is both a cautionary tale and an inspiring one. It reminds us that the pursuit of greatness can lead to extraordinary accomplishments. But it also serves as a reminder of the price of ambition. The story of Napoleon's image, crafted meticulously through both his actions and his appearance, continues to shape the way we understand leadership, legacy, and the power of perception. As we reach the final section of this journey through the curious case of Napoleon's haircut before his big battle, it's important to take a moment to reflect on the journey we've traveled together. We've explored the depths of Napoleon's life and his obsession with image, his rise and fall, and the enduring legacy of his carefully constructed persona. It's not just a tale of a military genius or an ambitious conqueror. It's a story about how power, perception, and image are inextricably linked. Napoleon's story teaches us something profound about human nature. He was, in many ways, a man who knew the value of self-presentation and the influence it could have over both his supporters and enemies. From the way he groomed himself before battle to his meticulous attention to the details of his public appearances, Napoleon understood that the way he was seen mattered just as much as the battles he won. His image was a tool, one that he wielded with as much precision as he did his military strategies. The story of Napoleon's rise, dominance, and eventual fall is a powerful reminder of the fragile nature of power. His insistence on controlling every aspect of his life, his image, and his empire ultimately led to his undoing. Despite his military genius, it was his obsession with maintaining his public persona and controlling how the world saw him that became both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. The very qualities that made him great, his ambition, his drive for perfection, his attention to detail, were the same qualities that led to his downfall. In his effort to craft an image of invincibility, Napoleon pushed his empire too far, too fast, and ultimately paid the price for it. Napoleon's downfall is, in many ways, the story of the limits of power. No matter how carefully crafted the image, no matter how well prepared the leader, there are forces beyond our control, be it nature, fate, or the actions of others, that can undo even the greatest of plans. His loss in Russia, the shattering defeat at Waterloo, and his subsequent exile are all part of the tragic irony that defines his legacy. The emperor who had once ruled Europe with an iron fist and a carefully groomed appearance found himself defeated, isolated, and alone, far from the grand battlefields where he had once commanded armies. Yet, even in exile, Napoleon continued to shape his image. His memoirs, written during his final years on St. Helena, were his attempt to control how history would remember him. His desire to present himself as a misunderstood genius, someone who had been betrayed by fate, speaks to the lengths to which he was willing to go to preserve his image. Even in defeat, Napoleon maintained a remarkable ability to shape the narrative of his life. His image continued to evolve in the minds of the French public, his soldiers, and future generations, even in death. Napoleon's persona lived on, influencing both politics and culture for years to come. Napoleon's legacy is complex, as is the image he left behind. To some, he is the embodiment of power and military genius, a man who conquered much of Europe and revolutionized warfare. To others, he is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the perils of seeking unchecked power. His life and image became a subject of constant reinterpretation, shaped by the political and cultural forces of each successive generation. Today, Napoleon is both a figure of admiration and a symbol of the dangers of ambition. His image has been reimagined countless times in books, films, and art, and continues to inspire fascination. But his story also serves as a reminder that power, even when achieved through genius and hard work, is fragile. The very things that make us successful, our image, our drive, our ambition, can also be the things that lead to our downfall. Napoleon, through his image and his legacy, shows us that the pursuit of greatness often comes with a heavy price. As we wind down, we can also reflect on the lasting impact of Napoleon's image, not just on the people of his time, but on the generations that followed. In some ways, his story has become a blueprint for understanding how individuals, movements, and even empires rise and fall. From his strategic brilliance to his obsession with maintaining his public persona, Napoleon has left a deep imprint on both history and our understanding of leadership. The way he meticulously crafted every aspect of his image, from his physical appearance to his military strategy, serves as a lasting reminder that perception is power, and that the way we are seen can influence the course of history. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Napoleon's legacy is how his story transcended time. The very image that seemed to define him during his reign has continued to evolve. In his final years, Napoleon, a man in exile, was still controlling how history would remember him. In a sense, this control over his own image allowed him to remain a force in the collective memory of Europe, and even the world long after his empire had crumbled. As we close tonight's exploration, we are left with the understanding that Napoleon's life was not just a saga of military conquest, but a study in the power of image. His careful attention to detail, the rituals he created for himself, like his haircut before battle, were all part of the larger narrative he sought to create around himself. In the end, Napoleon, the master of strategy and self-presentation, reminds us of the importance of how we present ourselves to the world. His story is a lesson in both the power of image and the inevitability of fate. Now, as you drift off to sleep, remember that Napoleon's image, like the man himself, has endured through the ages, both as a cautionary tale and a symbol of greatness. And like all great figures, his legacy lives on in the stories we continue to tell, the myths we create, and the images we craft of those who shape the course of history. It seems we have reached the conclusion of the script. The journey through Napoleon's complex legacy and his carefully crafted image has now come to a close. If you'd like to revisit any part of the story or dive into another chapter of history, just let me know. Until then, may your dreams be as vivid as the legend of Napoleon himself. Sweet dreams.